Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to remind you before I get started that there's a reception following this talk, and the exhibition galleries tonight will stay open until 8 p.m. if you want to go up and have a look at the Romanticism show. I'm Cassandra Albinson, Curator of Paintings and Sculpture at the Yale Center for British Art, and it's my great pleasure to welcome the first of the Andrew Cardiff Ritchie lectures for 2015. Established to honor the memory of Andrew Ritchie, director of the Yale University Art Gallery from 1957 to 1971, these annual lectures are jointly sponsored by the Art Gallery and the Yale Center for British Art, bringing distinguished members of the international visual arts community to the university for public lectures. Our speaker tonight is Tim Clark. Tim is George C. and Helen N. Pardee Chair Emeritus of the History of Art Department at the University of California, Berkeley. He holds a BA in Modern History from Cambridge and a PhD in Art History from the Courtauld Institute, University of London. Clark is the author of a series of books about the social character and formal dynamics of modern art. In 1973, he published both Image of the People, Gustave Courbet and the 1848 Revolution, and The Absolute Bourgeois, Artists and Politics in France, 1848 to 1851. These monumental interventions, one pointed and the other ranging across art and life under the Second Republic in France, argued forcefully that aesthetic works created in periods of revolution are the history of these movements, rather than simply a response to events. This project was followed by the Painting of Modern Life, Paris and the Art of Manet and his Followers, which pressed us as art historians to look not just at painting, but at aesthetic productions across media. Clark has written compellingly on topics from Jacques-Louis David's self-portraits to Picasso to L.S. Lowry. He continues his engagement with the art and politics of the left, and Clark currently writes art criticism for the London Review of Books. He's preparing two books as well, one titled Cézanne and Materialism, and the other titled Heaven and Earth, Bruegel, Poussin, Giotto, Veronese. On behalf of both museums at Yale, it's a big topic. On behalf of both museums at Yale, I'm very pleased to welcome Tim Clark to the podium to deliver a lecture entitled Attempting Impossibilities, Hazlitt on Turner and Blake.
Thank you so much. Attempting Impossibles might be an alternative title for the book, yes. Unfortunately, a book for its time, I think. Heaven on Earth. I want to say thank you, first of all, very much. Thank you for the invitation and for the chance to see the remarkable show. And in particular, I'd like to say thank you to Jane, Elizabeth, and Isabel, who've been so patient and steered me through. The year is 1820. Théodore Géricault, aged 29, is at work on a series of portraits of mad men and women, most probably at the suggestion of his friend Étienne Georget, doctor at the Paris Asylum for Women. The young Géricault had already himself been the victim of at least one episode of mental breakdown and paranoia, the most recent only months previously. Georget may have commissioned the portraits as a form of therapy. Certainly the portraits confront the look of madness, the staring into a world where other people exist essentially on sufferance, at an infinite distance, off to one side of an irremediable privacy, in a way which, with what looks like first-hand knowledge, that was new in art. Géricault's earliest biographer, perhaps taking his cue directly from Georget, describes the sitters as monomaniacs. The man here a kleptomaniac, he says, the woman a monomane d'envie. For us, I suppose it's less the particular diagnoses that matter, more the shared atmosphere of absolute intentness, outwardness, fixation on something completely real, but not real for anyone else. The year to repeat is 1820. Francisco Goya, one time first painter to the King of Spain, though by this time under various kinds of religious and political suspicion, is painting the walls of his house on the banks of the Manzanares, putting oil paint directly on the plaster. He too, like Géricault, is recovering from illness. The world he makes for himself in the main rooms of the house is crowded and idiotic and often brutal, peopled by cretinous pilgrims and thugs. But it is also fundamentally empty, provisional, unfamiliar, encroached on by a nothingness that only a dog can look full in the face. At much the same moment, William Blake at South Molton Street in London seems to have been putting the finishing touches of gold paint on tempera, to a painting now called, to a painting now called The Ghost of a Flea. "I'll tell you all about it, sir," said its first owner, John Varley, a few years later, talking to one of Blake's first biographers. "I called upon him one evening and found Blake more than usually excited. He told me that he'd seen a wonderful thing, the ghost of a flea. He looked earnestly into a corner of the room and then said, 'Here he is. Reach me my things, I'll keep my eye on him.' There he comes, his eager tongue whisking out of his mouth, a cup in his hand to hold blood and covered with a scaly skin of gold and green. As he described him, so he drew him." Some later Blake scholars, confronted by the weirdness of Varley's story, speculate that Blake may have been playing on Varley's belief in the material reality of Blake's visions. Varley was himself a mystic. But I have no doubt that Blake was in earnest. The flea is exactly the kind of creature we fancy Géricault's madmen are looking at. One can imagine the nasty thing living in the fur of Goya's long-suffering dog. Blake's flea, taking it now as a figure from Blake's cosmology, is nature according to Sade, a theatre of pitiless predators, human as well as animal, all essentially malevolent, bloodthirsty, filled with clumsy comic cunning. The flea is a mountebank. The stage curtains on either side of him have been thrown back, and a hissing comet crosses the Goya void. And yet the flea is pitiful. He's tripping the boards of his own blood obsession, trying to be more monstrous than he is. This is what makes him Blake's creation, not Sade's. The flea in Blake's universe, and it's important that the tiniest of animals is established against the vastness of the night sky. The flea is cousin to the worm. The worm in Blake stands for forgiveness as opposed to the flea's malevolence. The cut worm forgives the plough, to quote the Proverbs of Hell. We'll return to this. My year 1820 is an artifact, of course. I think it entirely possible that Goya's black paintings, Géricault's mad portraits, and Blake's Ghost of Flea were indeed being worked on at the same moment in 1820, and the possibility should give us pause. But dates are uncertain. How couldn't they be, given the privacy and idiosyncrasy of the pictures in question? The black paintings seem never to have been talked about in the artist's lifetime or shown to others beyond Goya's immediate circle of friends. They were one man's choice of interior decoration. When the public first got a look at them, decades later, at the 1878 Exposition Universelle in Paris, they were unanimously ignored by the critics. Blake's Ghost of a Flea didn't enter the public realm until 1886 in Edinburgh as part of an international exhibition of industry, science, and art with the late Victorian title, quite a helpful one, I think, a vampire. Géricault's portraits were exhibited last of all at the Exposition Internationale in Paris in 1887. It seems that only one journalist took them seriously. I've been trying to dramatize in these opening examples to bring back to life two cliches about the art we call romantic. First, that Romanticism ushers into the realm of representation a set of human conditions and more than human conditions which had previously been thought of as unspeakable or delusive or simply distressing or insignificant and best ignored. Madness, despair, the malevolence of nature, nothingness, absolute personal aloneness, together with the power of the lone individual to envision an alternative world to replace the one he or she has lost or lives in fear of, that dangerous power we call the imagination. Second, that the occupation of this strange new ground by Romanticism put art at odds with the common understandings of its parent culture. And we shouldn't take common understandings to be necessarily a pejorative. Common understandings can be, and very often are, strong, sane, and capacious. A critic like William Hazlitt, who we'll come to in a moment, is all of the above. Common understandings can surely claim in the first place, as perhaps Goya's and Blake's cannot, to be shareable, to have purchase on a reality recognized by others, and therefore subject to correction, to proper evaluation by others. The thought that the new art might be radically incorrigible, if I may borrow a term from Wittgenstein, is very much on Hazlitt's mind. And we should take seriously, I think, without the self-congratulatory glow of hindsight, the fact that art of Blake's and Goya's kind seemed really, at the time, to even the best and most sympathetic witnesses to have left the world of reason behind. The diarist Crabbe Robinson tells us, it's not clear when what he's reporting took place, but most likely around 1820, that Wordsworth, who as early as 1807 had copied Holy Thursday and the Tiger into a commonplace book, had this to say of Blake in conversation. There is no doubt that the man is mad, but there is something in this madness which I enjoy more than the sense, he capitalizes sense, the sense of Walter Scott or Lord B. The poet Southey called on Blake in South Molton Street in 1811 and, I quote, admired both his designs and his poetic talents at the same time that he held him for a decided madman. Blake, he says, spoke of his visions with the diffidence that is usual with such people and didn't seem to expect that he should be believed. This prepares us finally for the entire decency and humanity of Hazlitt. Crabbe Robinson seems to have read Hazlitt some of the songs of innocence and experience in 1811. I take it that Robinson had copies of the illuminated books. How else would he have known them? And that Hazlitt saw the engraved and coloured pages. Southey, you will have noticed, admired specifically Blake's designs as well as his poetry. Hazlitt, and here is Robinson's diary entry, was initially a little more guarded. Had a call from Turner and from W. Hazlitt. I mean, it's almost too perfect that Turner was there as well. Was Turner there as well or earlier in the day? Heaven knows. Had a call from Turner and from W. Hazlitt. I showed W.H. Blake's Young, that is Blake's illustrations to Young's Night Thoughts. He saw no merit in them as designs. I read him some of the poems. He was much struck with them and expressed himself with his usual strength and singularity. They are beautiful, he said, and only too deep for the vulgar. He has no sense of the ludicrous, and as to a god, a worm crawling in a privy is as worthy an object as any other, all being to him indifferent. So to Blake, the chimney sweeper, etc. He's ruined by vain struggles to get rid of what presses on his brain. He attempts impossibles. W.H. preferred the chimney sweeper. These lines are regularly quoted in the Blake literature, but not, I think, prodded at enough for clues to the character and motivation of Hazlitt's criticism. What struck him in particular and why? It's surely clear that Crabbe Robinson is remembering words Hazlitt produced as a response to specific poems and perhaps images, not simply a verdict on Blake as a whole. I quote again, "He has no sense of the ludicrous, and as to a god, a worm crawling in a privy is as worthy an object as any other, all being to him indifferent, so to Blake, the chimney sweeper, etc." What Hazlitt is trying to come to terms with, it seems to me, are the three identities mentioned: God, the chimney sweeper, and the worm crawling in a privy. They are, he's right, representative inhabitants of Blake's early universe. And it strikes me as significant and also very touching that Hazlitt, the serious radical, looks to be struggling at his first encounter with the songs, above all with the scope, the unnerving sheer range of Blake's human and non-human sympathies. The flea, in this case, equals the worm crawling in a privy. I believe this means that Robinson, in addition to the songs, may have shown Hazlitt the great Gates of Paradise in its 1793 incarnation, and specifically page 16, which is up there. "I have said to the worm, thou art my mother and my sister." This is a hard plate and text to interpret. Blake has modified a terrible, despairing cry from the book of Job, where Job, in his wretchedness, confronts God with the fact of death. "If I wait, the grave is mine house. I have made my bed in the darkness. I have said to the pit, thou art my father, to the worm, thou art my mother and my sister." This is Job, to quote a recent commentator, the Job who grieves and curses and rails. Blake, as I say, has his own view of Job's misery. David Erdman believes that the plate is intended to let us escape from the horror of the moment and glimpse a future victory of the imagination. I think this mistakes the plate's atmosphere of inconsolable sadness. Blake's insistence on the date beneath his caption, 17th of May, 1793, or 28 Floréal en un, in the months leading towards the Reign of Terror, reminds us of the link which we know was active in Blake's thinking between the worm and the lowly human being, and between a form of antinomian religious thinking and a politics of darkness. The chimney sweeper, Hazlitt's other main point of reference, drives home the lesson. The page in the Songs of Experience is not one of Blake's strongest visually, though even the naivety of the drawing has its point, as if the sweeper had dictated the terms of his own depiction. But the poem is searing, whether read in 1793 or 1811. And because I am happy and dance and sing, they think they have done me no injury, and are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery. The cut worm may forgive the plough, the chimney sweeper or the sans-culotte in the end may not. One law for the lion and the ox is oppression, says another Blake proverb. Put the flea and the worm in place of the lion and the ox. It is painful to see Hazlitt trying and failing to come to terms with the implication of Blake's Jacobin pantheism. Not all romantic art poses challenges to common wisdom in the way Blake's does. But of the romanticism that matters most, we can agree so far on two things. That it moves the imagination into hitherto largely uncharted territory, courting the dangerous and the ludicrous, and that therefore it is met very often with misunderstanding or rueful rejection by even the strongest representatives of the culture at large. I want to talk for the rest of my hour about the nature of that misunderstanding in Hazlitt's case, trying to keep the scales evenly weighted, trying, for instance, to see the justice of his "he has no sense of the ludicrous" as regards Blake, but trying also to see the point of Blake's very English lack of a sense of humour. The exercise will necessarily be speculative. We have very little beyond Crabbe Robinson to give us a sense of Hazlitt's actual engagements with Blake's work, and the best we can do is look at Blake in the light of Robinson's phrases and of what we know in general about Hazlitt's view of art. I shall go on to do this, but first I want to turn to another of Hazlitt's judgments of Romanticism, about which we know considerably more, what he had to say about the art of William Turner. It may help us in the end with Blake. It seems strange to me that the piece of Hazlitt's art criticism that is by far the best known and most often quoted is his verdict on Turner's landscapes, that they are pictures of nothing and very like. Strange for several reasons. First, because Hazlitt claims that the famous verdict isn't his, though the signs are that he agrees with it. Someone said of his landscapes that they were pictures of nothing and very like. It could very well be that the someone was Hazlitt, for all the pretense it was not. The more pointed or impertinent the aphorism, often the greater the temptation to put it in someone else's mouth. Second, the celebrity of the 6 words seems peculiar, because the words appear in a footnote, as if Hazlitt wanted them half demoted from his main text. Hazlitt's words were published first in the Examiner for February the 18th, 1816, in an untitled article. When he republished the essay in the Round Table the following year, he gave it the title On Imitation. The essay goes immediately to the heart of Hazlitt's view of art and his sense of art's importance. It begins with the art of the Netherlands. I've chosen to show you De Hoog's mother taking lice from her child's hair, a sort of, I guess, continuing the flea theme. It is no doubt much more sober than some of the scenes Hazlitt mentions, but I think it speaks to his essential point. Objects in themselves disgusting or indifferent, he says, often please in the imitation. A brick floor, a pewter plate, an ugly cur barking, a Dutch boor smoking or playing at skittles, the inside of a shambles, a fishmonger's or a greengrocer's stall, should we add to the list a chimney sweeper and even a worm in a privy, have been made very interesting pictures by the fidelity, truth, and spirit with which they have been copied. But why is the essay's essential question? Why does the fidelity or truth of a copy please us? Hazlitt's answer is that any effective imitation puts the object being imitated in a new light, It does cognitive work for us. The chief reason, then, why imitation pleases, he writes, is because by exciting curiosity and inviting a comparison between the object and the representation, it opens a new field of inquiry and leads the attention to a variety of details and distinctions not perceived before. Details and distinctions, the words here will recur when we come to Turner. Imitation, then, is an intellectual activity, but, says Hazlitt, it's prone to a characteristic pathology. Put briefly, the activity of making likenesses in paint and the difficulty of so doing become the focus of the artist's attention and not the objects in the world to which the activity is directed. Difficulty, strangeness, and extraordinariness displaces common knowledge. The mechanic artist, opposed here, as always in Hazlitt, to the true genius, the mechanic artist sees only that which nobody else sees and is conversant only with the technical language and difficulties of his art. Such artists see with different eyes from the multitude, but the true genius, though it has new sources of pleasure opened to it, does not lose its sympathy with humanity. Difficulty for its own sake is a trap. And here comes the footnote. We here allude particularly to Turner, the ablest landscape painter now living, whose pictures are, however, too much abstractions of aerial perspective and representations not so properly of the objects of nature as of the medium through which they are seen. They are the triumph of the knowledge of the artist and of the power of the pencil over the barrenness of the subject. They are pictures of the elements of air, earth, and water. The artist delights to go back to the first chaos of the world, or to that state of things when the waters were separated from the dry land, and light from darkness, but as yet no living thing nor tree bearing fruit was seen upon the face of the earth. All is without form and void. Someone said of his landscapes that they were pictures of nothing and very like. Several things could follow by way of commentary. One would like to know which pictures by Turner Hazlitt had in mind as he wrote. And I shan't be able to escape the question of whether his judgment is at all defensible. But the first thing that strikes me about Hazlitt's footnote is that it doesn't really connect with the argument in the text it's appended to. That argument, you'll recall, is all about the appeal to artists of sheer technique and the too great tendency of art to run into pedantry and affectation. That's a quote. But look at the footnote again. I cannot see that it accuses Turner, and by implication the Romantic artist, simply of obsession with technique or a taste for difficulty. It's not the case that Turner, as Hazlitt sees him, fails to care what aspect of the world, what set of objects and occasions he applies his powers to. It's the aspects and objects he does care to seize on that Hazlitt finds rebarbative. Hazlitt's difficulty with Blake is analogous. I think, in a word, that Hazlitt's footnote is essentially an amplification of the sentence already quoted from earlier in the paragraph. The true genius, though it has new sources of pleasure open to it, does not lose its sympathy with humanity. What kind of sympathy with humanity is there in Turner, is Hazlitt's question. Isn't what is striking about Turner's world, he asks, an essential barrenness of subject? The artist, he writes, delights to go back to the first chaos of the world, or to that state of things when the waters were separated from the dry land and light from darkness. All is without form and void. They are pictures of the elements of air, earth, and water. We might immediately ask, why? Pictures of the elements in formation. are thought by Hazlitt to threaten the play of common human sympathies. Partly, I think, it seems to depend on the pictures that Hazlitt is recalling. Somewhere close by in Hazlitt's memory, I believe, are engravings after the Sistine ceiling. Well, I have the pleasure of showing you a colour reproduction rather than an engraving. This is Light from Darkness. Engravings after the Sistine ceiling, and of course Hazlitt's admiration for, but also fear of, Michelangelo's imaginative power, specifically his willingness to imagine the emergence of the object world from utter nothingness. The nothing of the phrase in Hazlitt's footnote has Michelangelo in the background. But just as present to Hazlitt clearly were paintings by Turner, done a few years before, in which a division of light from darkness or a separation of waters from dry land had been transposed from the key of the Sistine, the key of massive symmetry of the first making of distinctions, to that of catastrophe. Turner's Deluge had been shown at the Royal Academy in 1813. His Hannibal has disappeared here. Never mind, he'll come up in a minute. Had been the central object of the year before. I'll go back to the Deluge. In the Sistine ceiling, as Hazlitt put it in his essay on Gusto, form is intended to convey, above all, an idea of moral grandeur and even of intellectual dignity. God in Michelangelo, he says, is man perfected, capable of executing with ease the determined purposes of the will, expressing his conscious power and capacity. But supposing an artist of Michelangelesque intensity were to put his gifts in the service of despair, singing the fallacies of hope, showing human power and capacity as so many straws in an alpine wind. Supposing Turner is that artist, this may be Hazlitt's fear. Too much, too wide a sympathy for men and animals is the danger in Blake's case, too little in Turner's. The true genius, to recall Hazlitt's main argument, though it has new sources of pleasure open to it, does not lose its sympathy with humanity, and it has to recognize where its sympathies must stop. We are looking for the causes of a phobia. The phobia was certainly overdetermined. The clue to another strand lies, I think, in the footnote's judgment that Turner's paintings are too much abstractions of aerial perspective and representations not so properly of the objects of nature as of the medium through which they are seen. Let me indicate the kind of picture Hazlitt may have had in mind at the date he was writing. The painting of Richmond Hill and Bridge that Turner had on display in his gallery from 1808 onwards seems a candidate. The fabulous Teignmouth in the Turner Gallery from 1812 on, and soon bought by Lord Egremont, is another. And I think of the centerpiece of Turner's 1810 submission to the Royal Academy, the sun-obliterated Lowther Castle. Too much abstractions of aerial perspective, that seems to me the key phrase. Abstraction, as all readers of Hazlitt will be reminded, is the big bad word of Hazlitt's aesthetics, above all of his arguments in favor of painting. Painting, for him, is the art of the concrete. One is never tired of painting. Here are the famous sentences. Because you have to set down not what you knew already, but what you have just discovered. In the former case, that is, setting down what you knew already, you translate feelings into words. In the latter, that is, in painting the discoveries of your senses, you translate names into things. ours. There is a continual creation out of nothing going on. The closeness here to the someone's verdict on Turner is instructive. It is closeness but refutation. Painting is creation out of nothing. It puts particulars in place of concepts. The ideas we cherish most, writes Hazlitt, as ideas and idealities, as thoughts half put into words in our minds, exist best in a kind of shadowy abstraction. But in painting, ideas are put to the test of the senses and thrive on the test. New details and distinctions, to return to the language of Hazlitt's 1814 article, emerge. With every stroke of the brush, a new field of inquiry is laid open. But supposing a great artist wished not to create out of nothing, but to show, I borrow famous words from Wallace Stevens, to show nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. To see and show, again borrowing the language of Hazlitt's main text, only that which nobody else sees. We could add abstraction then, airy generality now posing as irreducible individual vision to the roster of Romanticism's new and dangerous art values. Abstraction, ambiguity, fragmentation, elusiveness, difficulty. Hazlitt distrusted all of them, politically, ethically. Here is Hannibal. The language of poetry, he writes in his great essay on Shakespeare's Coriolanus from the same moment. The language of poetry naturally falls in with the language of power. The principle of poetry is everything by excess. It presents a dazzling appearance. This is the logic of the imagination and the passions, which seek to aggrandize what excites admiration and to heap contempt on misery, to raise power into tyranny and to make tyranny absolute. Fantastic judgment on Coriolanus, by the way. Now, of course, we, or rather I, don't agree with this. I go on looking at Turner through Ruskin's eyes. Mike Lee has not budged my allegiance an inch. I believe that Turner's pictures are properly described, not as abstractions of aerial perspective, but as concretizations of the same, bringing into being as an object world in its own right, the medium through which the familiar world is seen. But I think I understand why Hazlitt saw the matter differently. The atmosphere, the medium, was for him too close a partner to, or even a metaphor for, the medium of mind. Nature and the elements, however inflected and mobilized, would always end in art, he believed, as a reality detached from and superior to the hopeless efforts of human beings to impose form on the world. As a response to Hannibal, this is at least comprehensible. The history of mankind is a romance. I quote the Coriolanus essay again. A masque, a tragedy, constructed upon the principles of poetical justice. It is a noble or a royal hunt in which what is sport to the few is death to the many, and in which the spectators halloo and encourage the strong to set upon the weak. What if, worse than a new Michelangelo, Turner became a new savage Shakespeare? I can imagine this question occurring in front of the Hannibal. We return to Blake. Again, I'm going to start from Crab Robinson's diary, and in particular from the very first words he records Hazlitt saying. I want to repeat them with two of the strongest and strangest of the song's pages in view, Human Abstract and Poison tree, because these, or something like them, are what I imagine Hazlitt to be responding to. And I cannot resist adding that the 2 pages anticipate much stronger ones, those that follow a year later in 1794 in Blake's incomparable first book of Urizen. They are beautiful, says Hazlitt, and only too deep for the vulgar. Let's leave vulgarity aside for the moment, together with the connection that ran through Hazlitt's thinking between the vulgar and the many, or the weak and miserable, that is, the wider humanity he thinks Turner despairs of. It's the first 3 words that concern me, his first and essential aesthetic judgment. They are beautiful. They are beautiful, in my judgment, and it seems to me that the character of their beauty has been very little described. Art historians have told us many valuable things about Blake's sources and the ways his style belongs to the period. But Hazlitt, if he had written about Blake, would have had a different question in mind. He would have wanted to pin down the peculiar nature of Blake's individuality as an artist and the link between his special kind of beauty and the other vital judgment he produces in 1811, that Blake attempts impossibles. Beauty and impossibility, those are the terms to be joined. I intend then, in the time left, to try to do just that, to sketch out the first outlines of a criticism of Blake done, dare I say it, in Hazlitt's spirit. One possible starting point, it seems to me, is a small and wonderful watercolour belonging to Tate Britain, entitled, usually with a question mark, Loss and Orc. Identities, even if here the 2 names from Blake's mythology seem to apply, are difficult. Let's agree to call Loss, the standing figure on the left, the figure of imaginative and political energy in human history as Blake conceived it, and Orc, that same energy taking revolutionary form, often with blood on its hands. It's not clear what Blake thought about the blood at precisely the time he painted the watercolour, probably in the early 1790s, and even less clear what Loss, here or in general, thinks. If the French Revolution was in question, and how could it not be, then the year or month the painting was done would make a difference. Remember 17th of May on the worm plate from 1793. Orc, in the present picture, is manacled, somewhat weakly, 4 times to the earth. Perhaps one of the manacles is hammered into a boulder. Orc may, in Blake's view, be essentially Loss's doing, Loss's emanation. But Loss may also, in some sense, literal or mental, have forged the manacles. The bloody form of revolution may be a product of the imprisonment. The marvelous attentiveness and horror of Loss's body, it puts most other neoclassical dumb shows utterly to shame, I think, tells the story. The yellow of the earth is Loss's openness and electricity, the black smudge on the hillside, their repression. The yellow in particular, and its second appearance as a ghost on the hilltop next to the oily sea, is a stroke of genius. Loss's hands are a similar triumph, the way they catch the light and shade, and the way they touch the top edge of the paper, further electrifying the pictorial field. These reach back to Marc Antonio's engravings after Raphael, which of course Blake worshipped, and outdo them. Blake scholars tend to be interested in the little painting because of its date. The evidence points to its having been done early in the 1790s, perhaps as early as 1791, which could suggest that Loss and Orc emerged first as ideas for Blake in visual form, ahead of their elaboration in verse. But who knows how many drafts of Europe and America have been lost. Certainly the figures in Loss and Orc recur, reversed by the printing process, as main actors in a scene at the start of America, published in 1793 by a strange chance. This is not one of the pages of America on the show upstairs, but there are other wonderful ones. Here, at the top, the shadowy daughter of Urthona, beauty, sexuality, and repression, joins Loss in bewailing, which means also celebrating, red orcs everywhere in chains. Terror is close. It's not clear in the watercolor whether Loss is recoiling guiltily from orcs' agony or is afraid the manacles may tear from their sockets. Compel the poor, says Urizen in Blake's The Four Zoas, reading from his Book of Brass. Compare the poor to live upon a crust of bread by soft, mild arts. Smile when they frown, frown when they smile. And when a man looks pale with labour and abstinence, say that he looks healthy and happy. And when his children sicken, let them die. There are enough born, even too many, and our earth will be overrun without these arts. Parson Malthus is on Blake's mind. But stop. I believe the comparisons and quotes I've just brought on are apposite, yet nonetheless I'm reproducing what seems to me the problem with our usual approach to Blake as an artist. I've left Hazlitt's directness behind. All critics of the poet's visual imagery, wishing to understand what they're looking at and feeling the weight of Blake's words close by, inevitably turn to the words for guidance. The poetry begins to enfold the image. It frames and informs it. It claims the image as an extension or intensification of prophecy. But is this what matters in the watercolor? I think not. The image is great, not by reason of what it may mean, but by reason of its distinctness, its emptiness, the ferocious boundedness of its imagining of a non-meeting of bodies. And to say this, we know, is to follow Blake himself. A spirit and a vision are not, as the modern philosophy supposes, a cloudy vapor or a nothing. Nothing. They are organized and minutely articulated. This is Blake addressing his public in 1809. He who does not imagine in stronger and better lineaments and in stronger and better light than his perishing mortal eye can see does not imagine at all. Nature has no outline, but imagination has. The more distinct, sharp and wiry the bounding line, the more perfect the work of art. How do we distinguish one face or countenance from another, but by the bounding line and its infinite inflections and movements? What is it that builds a house and plants a garden, but the definite and determinate? Leave out this line, and you leave out life itself. You'll realize, of course, how much all of this resonates with Hazlitt's devotion to painting as the art of the concrete, the art he believes that thrives on details and distinctions. Again, there are dangers. Blake's theory of art is one thing, his practice another. The bounding line in Loss and Orc is a flexible, pragmatic invention, shifting in and out of focus as the whole image dictates. The right edge of Loss's body has many possible positions in space. Movements overtake it. Orc's torsion and compression come out of are an expression of the darkness pressing down on him. The darkness is as indeterminate as watercolor can be. But let's interpret the bounding line and the ideals of distinctness and minute articulation proposed in Blake's writings as broadly, as undogmatically as Blake himself did, burin or brush in hand. Loss and orc is a prototype. Everything I've said of its treatment of edge, space, and colour remains true of the best of Blake's later achievements in painting. True to God judging Adam, for example, or the intricate tonal mosaic of David delivered out of many waters, or the brutal symmetries of the blasphemer. Nonetheless, it is still the case that between Blake, the poet, and Blake as maker of pictures, there remains an enormous discomforting gap. For Blake, I would suggest, is not a visual poet. That is to say, his concreteness is not descriptive, not attached to the specifics of appearance. Blake's poetry is out to ironize eyesight, in other words, boundedness and identity, in order to have the forms of infinity flash up before us as only language can have them flash. There are many pages in the prophetic books, in fact. This is page 12 of the first book of Horizon, where an image leaps out at us and flashes by as if just lit by a bolt of lightning. Blake's poems are songs dependent on the power of word or cadence to evoke for a moment the full particular that makes one's state of the human present, or improvised epics, likewise carried most powerfully by the timbre of the singer's voice, always bewildering and repetitive, pushing impatiently forward, impelled by an unexpectedness, a peripeteia to come. Neither lyric nor epic in Blake need or want to dwell on what the world exactly looks like. Writing in Blake, then, races past us, conjuring possibilities, positing and liquidating identities. The verge of non-existence, I quote, or the margin of non-entity, to use his words from the Four Zoas, are uniquely Blake's territory. If he'd heard Hazlitt accuse him of painting pictures of nothing, his response would have been complex. This is his territory as a poet, I mean. Pictures, by contrast, though they will too include the threat or reality of non-entity, seem to exist for Blake, seem necessary for him, because they are his means of conjuring entity out of the flux. He who does not imagine in stronger and better lineaments and in stronger and better light than his perishing mortal eye can see does not imagine at all. I show you now the page in the Book of Horizon that directly faces the one you've just been looking at. It's Blake's version, of course, of Michelangelo's Light from Darkness. Distinctness and salience, we know, are Blake's great pictorial values. Pictures without them don't count. And distinctness is above all a property of space. More particularly and technically, it seems to issue from Blake's strange and elaborate printmaking process, his endless experiments with the matter of relief. Scholars, looking round for contemporary testimony on Blake's way of doing things, lean heavily on a reminiscence by Frederick Tatham. I want to read you Tatham's famous testimony with two states of Blake's 1795 The House of Death in view, one belonging to Tate Britain, the one on the left, and the other to the Fitzwilliam. Here's Tatham. He painted roughly and quickly so that no colour would have time to dry. He then took a print of that on paper, and this impression he coloured up in watercolours, repainting his outline on the millboard when he wanted to take another print. This plan he had recourse to because he could vary slightly each impression, and each having a sort of accidental look, he could branch out so as to make each one different. The accidental look they had was very enticing. Tatham makes clear in another letter that the accident wasn't just a spurt of variation from Blake's point of view, but a quality in itself, which the artist for some reason wanted and then elaborated. There was a look of accident about his mode, which he afterwards availed of and tinted so as to bring out and favour what was there rather blurred. I think of accident as the visual equivalent of nonentity in Blake, and relief and the bounding line as identity asserting itself always against the odds. My guess is that the Fitzwilliam print is the last of the three states that survive, and I think it's the best. It strikes, that is, the most complex balance between a look of accident and a terrible, merciless distinctness. In The House of Death, Blake is illustrating some grisly lines from Paradise Lost. This brings him right into Hazlitt territory, by the way. Milton was one of Hazlitt's essential masters, his combination of radicalism and artificiality a constant challenge to Hazlitt's common sense. Here's the Milton passage that instigates The House of Death. A lazar house, it seemed, wherein were laid numbers of all diseased, all maladies of ghastly spasm. Dire was the tossing, deep the groans, despair tended the sick, busiest from couch to couch. And over them triumphant death his dart shook, but delayed to strike, though oft invoked with vows as their chief good and final hope. We're back, need I say it, in Book of Job territory. If I wait, the grave is my house. I have made my bed in the darkness. I mean, I am aware that my choice of Blake is very dark, isn't it? But I think that speaks to something. That the other side of Blake's vision is this extraordinary, bleak compassion for marks of weakness, marks of woe. I mean, a far deeper sense of the state of the human than anyone else in his time. One wonders what he might have made of Géricault's London lithographs. So the traditional title of the print is euphemistic, surely. This is really the house of the death that refuses to come to those who desperately want it. Despair takes up position to the right of the scene, holding a knife but too stupefied to use it. In the Fitzwilliam print, there is no sign of Milton's darts, which appear in the Tate version as shards of ice, and death's instrument looks to be simply a scroll. It is written, says the scroll bearer, when your agony will end. God the Father and death are conflated, as they often are in Blake. Once again, as in Loss and Orc, a set of flexed fingers, those of the victim closest to us in spasm, pulls us into the pantomime. God the Father has his wrinkled eyes closed, but not, one senses, out of compassion. I know that the word relief in this context has an intolerable double meaning, but the triumph of the Fitzwilliam version is technical. It depends on the creation of a space fully appropriate to the appalling subject matter. There's much more colour in the Fitzwilliam print than in Tate's. Above all, an invading fiery red. It seems to be consuming a huddled sufferer in the right background. And there are more decisive deep darks holding and floating death on his cloud. Death's hyper-patriarchal beard, whose locks in the Tate version seem individually combed and arranged as by a cosmic hairdresser, is now cut off abruptly by the cloud of fire. Colour and edge conspire finally to put God nowhere, in a dreadful non-proximity to the humans he won't help. Spatially again, as with Loss and Orc, but now on a grander scale and deploying with utter certainty a baffling range of techniques, spatially Blake thinks his subject through to the bitter end. The tension between sharp, unforgiving salience and volatile, smouldering, blotted atmosphere is stretched almost to breaking point. A pale halo insists on despair's idiocy. The sufferers catch reflections from Urizen's fire. The bottom edge of death's beard is as sharp as an axe. Put the House of Death finally next to the page from the Gates of Paradise. Remember that they are done only 2 years apart. Gates of Paradise is Blake before the terror, speaking the language of Orc Unchained. The House of Death is a post-Robespierre, post-revolutionary picture. The depth of its bitterness has partly to do with its historical moment. I shall say this in conclusion. In a sense, the case Hazlitt sketches is right. Blake attempts impossibles. He has no sense of the ludicrous. Even despair in the House of Death is open to that charge. And his revolutionary pantheism led him often into an utterly unshareable world. Maybe madness is the word for it. We shouldn't sneer or shudder at Wordsworth and Southey for producing it. But Blake's madness enabled a breadth and intensity of human sympathy, a vividness of sympathy, that it seems to me tragic Hazlitt could not respond to. Partly, as always in England, this had to do with divisions of class. Blake was a revolutionary and then counter-revolutionary craftsman. He came out of the world of London sectaries. His trade was basic to his worldview. He's as separate from the main line of gentility as any English artist has ever been. It's telltale that the generation of Blake's fellow romantics, Southey, Wordsworth, Charles Lamb, Hazlitt, and Crabbe Robinson, only seem to have come to know his work 20 or even 30 years after its first publication. Romanticism, so the common wisdom has it, is best characterized as the art that first found room at a revolutionary moment in history for modes of experience that had hitherto been outlawed or overlooked. The mad, the wild, the primitive, the abysmal, the agonized, the naive, the abject, the forlorn, and oppressed. The terms of inclusion here into the world of art were class-specific. The madman was more easily included than the worm or the chimney sweeper. The vision of a Jacobin artisan from south of the Thames was genuinely difficult for Hazlitt to find even a first foothold in. And the difficulties in English culture are still with us.